Stanford University.
Thank you all for joining us. This is a very special evening for the WSD Handa Center for Human Rights and International Justice, because it's the occasion of our inaugural public lecture on human rights, and we're very honored to have as our inaugural human rights lecturer Navi Pillay today. I want to thank the Stanford Global Studies staff, that's our home on the Stanford campus, and the staff of the Handa Center for all their work in preparing this event. Navi Pillay needs no introduction because she's been one of the most prominent individuals on the global stage of human rights for many, many years. Most recently, she served as the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights from 2008 to 2014, the only High Commissioner to have served for 2 terms. Prior to that, she began her career in South Africa as the first woman to start a law practice in her home province of Natal. She made a reputation as a defense attorney for anti-apartheid activists, which I don't need to tell you involved considerable courage and considerable risk. She then became the first non-white female judge ever appointed to the South African High Court. From there, she was called, after being elected by the General Assembly of the United Nations, to be one of the first judges at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, where she served first as a judge and then as the president of the tribunal for many years. And from there, she was elected as a judge in the appeals chamber of the International Criminal Court. After this very distinguished career in international justice on these 2 international tribunals, she became the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and a champion of human rights, addressing discrimination, the vulnerability of certain populations, migrants, the LGBTQ community, and others. She co-founded Equality Now, an international human rights organization, and she continues to engage herself in a wide variety of activities supporting human rights around the world. We're very privileged and honored that she's with us today. So she will speak about the achievements and challenges during her tenure as High Commissioner, and after that we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. During the lecture, cards will be provided for you to write questions on, and then we'll pass them forward and I will be moderating them. Students will be in the aisles to collect the questions throughout the lecture. So I want to thank you all for coming tonight, and let's welcome Madam Navi Pillay.
Thank you, David. You'll be sitting here. Good evening, everyone. Let me say it's such a pleasure to be here at the university, even though it took me about 22 hours to get here. But it's a great pleasure, and thank you for coming. I'd like to thank Global Studies program here at the university and the Handa Human Rights Center for inviting me. And I've come personally to stress how important the work of the Handa Human Rights Center will be for human rights defenders all over the world. I've been invited to speak and to reflect on my term as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and share some of the insights or lessons learned. And that's very awkward for me because you're going to hear a lot of I, me, myself in this speech. And so up front, let me preface my remarks to say that it is not possible for a single individual to carry out this very important mandate of protection and promotion of all human rights of all persons all over the world, together with the right to development. And so I want to make clear that I was fully supported by 1,000 staff based in Geneva, New York, and in 58 countries, who provided the verified factual information to the office to enable the High Commissioner to prepare a report on the human rights record of every country in the world. And more importantly, we worked very closely with civil society organizations. We have on our register almost 4,000 NGOs. So very vital information, and working in partnership, I should say, with NGOs, human rights defenders, journalists on the ground. I also want to be very cautious to point out that I'm no longer the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I retired with effect from the 1st of September. So sometimes I may slip up and still speak as if I'm the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So remember that I now speak as in my personal capacity. So what is the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights? Building on the work of each High Commissioner, this office has grown from a small entity of just over 100 staff when Mary Robinson was the High Commissioner, to and a presence in just 2 countries outside Geneva at that time, to more than, as I said, 1,000 staff and 58 presences worldwide. And these include embedding human rights advisors in the Security Council mandated peace missions. This is also a development that I pushed in my time. To ensure that everyone addresses human rights concerns on the ground. And so the Office of the High Commissioner provides technical advice, capacity, and training to both states and civil society organizations. It works very closely with NGOs, but also with national human rights institutions. The High Commissioner services now almost 100 of these national human rights institutions all over the world. Regretfully, there is not one established here, but these are very important institutions that receive the complaints of individuals. On the many official visits that I made to countries, and I visited 79 on formal missions, I always held discussions with the National Human Rights Commission and the NGOs, and this in turn informed my interchange with heads of state, heads of government, ministers, and parliamentarians. So this mandate offers a crucial opportunity for someone at a very high level to actually confront governments on the gaps in implementation of protection of human rights. And so therefore I want to say up front that it is a matter of grave concern for me that some state authorities continue to ignore or repress civil society organizations, human rights defenders, and the media. Country after country is now passing laws that prohibit NGO activity, prohibit them from receiving funds from overseas. When I raised this with Russia, they told me they were modeling themselves on the law in Canada. And I spoke to Ethiopia, and they said, well, we took the law from Russia. And that's what's going on now, all of which I see the effects of already of shrinking the democratic space for civil society organizations. And this is why I want to say to the university here how important the role of the Handa Human Rights Center will be, because you will be providing not only research material, sending your skilled people outside, but you would be a watchful eye, caring for human rights defenders all over. So how did all this start? It started 22 years ago in Vienna where the world's first conference on human rights was held. And the civil society, and particularly women, dominated that conference. We in South Africa had just won our freedom, and so President Mandela sent NGOs to this conference. It was our first experience, and I went as a lowly representative of a women's rights organization. And so I was there in the basement wandering around, collecting posters and so on. Little did I know that one day I will occupy the position of High Commissioner of Human Rights, which was the demand of civil society in Vienna. In my experience, nothing ever happens without push and pressure from civil society. It's not as if governments woke up one day and said, we want to be more accountable. So the pressure comes from civil society. So totally let's credit the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action as the fulfillment of NGO demands. That resulted in the General Assembly resolution setting up the mandate of a High Commissioner for Human Rights. And so I would say on reflection that the challenges and obstacles faced in human rights protection in national and international arenas have much in common. And when I took office, I received both good advice and some admonitions on what to do and what not to do. Some of the approaches were subtle and some not so subtle efforts to influence and exercise oversight on this position. Because the mandate was unique. It did bestow power on one individual to be the voice of the voiceless and to address rights. I received a phone call from the UN Secretary General saying he's recommending me for this position. And shortly after that, I received a phone call from his office saying that there was an objection to my appointment coming from the US State Administration at that time. Condoleezza Rice didn't like my views on reproductive rights and was concerned that I would influence my office with those views. And this individual who called me from the Secretary General's office said he gave them the assurance that I will not influence my office with these ideas. And he said, can you just send me a written undertaking? We won't use it, we'll just lock it away in a drawer. But as long as we have it on record. And I refused. Now that's the first act of what you would expect a judge to do. So my background is lawyer and a judge, and it's respect principles. If you are ordering other people to obey the law and abide by the standards and principles, you begin there, no matter whether you have an audience witnessing this or not. And I think then it was the first shock to UN officials, somebody actually refusing to do what they had wanted me to do. The first major difficulty I faced was the review conference of the Durban Conference on Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerances. Many of you will recall that the original Durban Conference wound up in Durban, my city, about 2 days before 9/11 occurred here. And at that conference, I was not present. I was sitting as a judge on the Rwanda tribunal in Arusha. So at the conference, I understand there was acrimonious statements made in relation to Israel, particularly in the halls occupied by the NGOs, but also in the main hall where ambassadors participated. And you will recall that Colin Powell then walked out of that conference and withdrew the US delegation. But the conference continued, and a good outcome document came out of it. And that's the DDPA, the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. This was knocked out by my predecessor, Mary Robinson, and Nkosazana Zuma, the then South African Foreign Minister, now Secretary General of the AU Commission. And everybody welcomed the document, and I should point out that the Israeli Foreign Minister immediately entered on his website that Israel emerged as a victor from that conference. But over the next 8 years, it became a real difficult political issue in the UN, with divisions between the North and South. And every year, the human rights program was held up, sometimes voted on, sometimes accepted, at midnight on the 24th of December. Now, did I know any of this? No. So perfectly naively, the Secretary General told me, you have to resign as a judge and start here immediately because you have to get the review conference on. I started in September, and December that year, I got a call. Once again, it was a human rights program that was being held up, and it is part of the Secretary General's strategic framework, the work of all the other agencies. And I could see now why all the other agencies got to really dislike the human rights people, because we were holding up their program. So what was holding it up? This call surprised me. It came from the US mission. And the request to me was, if you delete the word Durban from the Durban Declaration, then we won't put your program to the vote. And I said, what about the Vienna Declaration? Shall I remove Vienna as well? And there was a dead silence. They did put it to the vote, but the program was adopted. So this is some of the background to why I was told by very many people that the Human Rights Council, which was created in 2006, the Human Rights Council is a successor to the old Human Rights Commission. The old Human Rights Commission was criticized for selectively targeting certain states. And at one point, the chair of that Human Rights Commission was Libya. And so certain lobbies constantly picked on that Libya chaired the Human Rights Commission. But that's history. In 2006, the Human Rights Council was established by the General Assembly. They debated whether they should have all states as members and decided it should be 47 states. So it's usually highly competitive as states compete to become members of the Human Rights Council. 47 members because it's a subsidiary body to the GA and not complementary to that parent body. And in the year I started, we received very welcome news from President Obama that the United States has decided to become a member of the Human Rights Council. So against much opposition from many quarters, he took that bold decision. And let me say up front that from the time the United States joined the Human Rights Council, there was a really a great energy, vitality there as they did apply pressure and raise human rights, and truly provided great support to me in my work. And so the review conference was then held, and unfortunately this is a conference, let me remind you, was on racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia. It's a review conference asking states to explain how they've implemented the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. And so honestly, I keep referring to where I come from as a judge. I thought people take these things seriously, something they pass, that they will implement it. But no, the whole thing became rather political. And Israel's complaint was that Israel was being targeted by this Human Rights Council, that's all they're doing, bashing Israel there. And every time the council was referred to as that discredited institution, once chaired by Libya. And this was the propaganda that I walked into, which had built up over 8 years from this time the Durban Declaration was enacted. So there you are. Even some of my staff would not cooperate with me in being the secretary to this World Review Conference because they felt it's not their job. Well, it's true it was not, but when the Secretary General nominated the High Commissioner to conduct this review conference, it had to be done. So unfortunately, President Obama decided not to participate in the review conference. They didn't provide any reasons. I had many engagements, and I myself couldn't understand what the point was. They kept harping on the bad treatment that Israel was subjected to at the Durban Conference. And I said, but that's history. Can we move now? We have a good document before us. As soon as President Obama announced that the United States will not participate in this conference, then like a pack of cards, 7 European states, including Australia, decided to withdraw from this conference. However, the conference still ended with a good outcome document, and that's the review document. So please look at both these documents, because now as I look at Ferguson here and Baltimore, it's very relevant that some action plans be developed to address the question of racial discrimination, even in this country. So now I want to recall how I addressed some of these challenging situations. And my goal in doing so is to say to you, this is what particularly you young people will face in life. You're given a mandate, everything is new to you. You're really beginning in a strange environment. How do you begin implementing this powerful mandate of covering everyone's rights all over the world? So I'm recalling what was said to me in the halls by member states themselves. I was told by some state representatives not to name any state for criticism in my addresses to the Human Rights Council. So the president of the Human Rights Council is an elected member state, but the Secretariat of the Human Rights Council was the High Commissioner, who usually led the discussions on the substance. And I felt, how can I address human rights questions if I do not mention the states where these are occurring? But their reason was that that would be an intrusion into state sovereignty and interference in looking at the internal affairs of a state. And believe me, that is still the objections raised again and again, as soon as you point out some gaps in protection, that suddenly it's internal affairs of a state. And so I started out by singling out a few states where it was necessary to do so, and by the end of my term, at the end of 6 years, I had named like 55 country situations by name. And they began to understand that. My aim was to be inclusive and focus on all concerns. And let me say, a few developed countries objected to me shining the lens in their backyards on discrimination, for instance, against minority groups, such as the Roma and migrants. And they said that I should instead be focusing on gross human rights violations in conflicts where thousands of people were being killed. So this is how they interpreted my mandate, and my interpretation is that all human rights are important to all individuals. You can't actually grade the human rights and say one is more important than the other. I also found that there was a skewed emphasis in that office on civil and political rights, meaning conflicts or lack of fundamental freedoms in faraway places, especially developing countries. and less focus on economic, social, and cultural rights and the right to development. This complaint was raised very often in the Council by developing countries, both in the Human Rights Council and the GA. And I thought that that was a valid point that was being made to me, because human rights are all rights, both economic and social and civil and political. Clearly, you can't exercise your civil right to freedom of expression if you don't have food. So they go together. And so I began rectifying this. There was some resistance to this from those who considered that economic rights and the right to development were not rights, but aspirations. Human rights protects, and I'm quoting here from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Human rights protects both freedom from fear and freedom from want. And so the Office of the High Commissioner has come a long way in pushing for these rights. A rights-based approach in the Rio outcome document and the post-2015 development agenda, and for the recognition as rights of the right to food, the right to water, the right to health, housing, and eradication of poverty. These are struggles fought over a tiny word here and to get the rights language in. One country in particular, you can guess who, objected to me at bringing the caste-based discrimination into the international fora. They had successfully kept that issue out of the United Nations for over 60 years. And it came from one country who felt that that was an internal matter and as I said, they had succeeded in stopping this issue being raised, including during the Durban World Conference and the Review Conference. So I did become very unpopular with that one country, India, that claimed me as one of their own. Because for the first time we put it on the agenda of the Human Rights Council. Why did I do that? Because I met with very many people, and there's caste-based discrimination in many parts of the world, amongst indigenous community in the island outside Japan, Nepal is a huge problem. And when I left, the Dalits and many of these communities came to see me. They were just in tears because they said we had struggled over 60 years to get our issues addressed, and you were the one person who managed to put it on the agenda. Let me say I used some of my skills as a judge. As a judge, that's what judges do. We are judgmental, and then we punish people. And we can also tell the lawyers to shut up and sit down. I could not do that in the Human Rights Council. I was now an advocate for human rights. I had to learn diplomacy. But some of the ambassadors said to me, what's good about your approach is that you listen. You listen to our side of the story. And they said that comes from your judicial background. So using this background, I was able to persuade India that they are actually the only country in the world that has done something about caste-based discrimination. I said you have passed good laws, you have wonderful decisions from your Supreme Court. We need these good examples as I address caste-based discrimination in Mauritania, for instance, where there was still, would you believe it, slavery operating there based on color and religion. And they said, yes, but caste, the word caste is unique to India. And I said, so is apartheid. You know what? So is apartheid. And South Africa contributed this word to the rest of the world, and you should now let us use the word caste, because it particularly symbolizes bonded labor and everything else that goes with it. Another obstacle I met with was when states, particularly from the Arab world and Africa, urged me very strongly not to go there. Do not address LGBT rights. Because they said by doing so I was creating new rights and I should adhere to internationally agreed rights, and these rights are not internationally agreed. I took the approach that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to which they all subscribe, speaks of equality and non-discrimination. And I find here a group of people who are being discriminated against, not being treated equally. So I'm addressing the issue under that. But I very carefully address the issue in terms of violence and discrimination against LGBTI people. So for the very first time, there was a debate in the Human Rights Council and a resolution adopted asking the High Commissioner's Office to prepare a study on the incidence of violence and discrimination and lack of protection. And that's why we got that in. We did 2 studies. Here again, do look at them. The UN resolutions commissioned 2 worldwide studies against homophobia as a human rights violation. And I was truly shocked about the quantity of information that poured into our office from all over the world. Such a huge violation, and yet it was kept out of the halls of the UN. Combating impunity and strengthening accountability, the rule of law and democratic society underpins all the activities undertaken by the High Commissioner in the exercise of its mandate. So the office plays a major role in supporting the development and monitoring of human rights norms and standards by the human rights mechanisms. By human rights mechanisms, I mean the Human Rights Council, its UPR, or Universal Periodic Review, by which the human rights record of every state is scrutinized by other member states, and recommendations are made to that state by other member states, and the High Commissioner is directed to help that state to remedy these imperfections in protection. So it's a very new vision of not just criticizing or not naming and shaming, but a vision of trying to be helpful. And I instantly grabbed that, because what is our goal really is to make that change on the ground. When I went to Barbados, and I was the first High Commissioner to visit the Caribbean, the minister told me what a happy people they are. They're smiling all the time, and this is why the tourists come. She says, why do you think the tourists come? Because we laugh all the time. And I said, yes, but why do you beat up your children? So their laws allow for corporal punishment of children in homes, schools, in the public, and it was just rampant the way they were carrying that out. And the minister responded that that's the Caribbean culture, to beat up the children. And I said, no, it's a 50-year-old UK law you have here. You need to revisit these old laws and bring them up to international standard. So her response then was, can you send us a human rights advisor to help us do this? So just one example of how a High Commissioner for Human Rights was encouraging states to follow the international standards that they themselves adopted. As a judge, we always look at what's the law, and we stay within the law as we conduct each case. My job as High Commissioner to ask, so what's the law? What am I implementing here? I said to states, thank you very much for creating this wonderful framework of human rights protection. First, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, then these 2 important covenants on civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. So it's your framework. You now have to really try to adhere to those standards. So that approach, you will see, instantly demolishes the so-called human rights are Western and being imposed on us argument. So Human Rights Council is one of the human rights mechanism. I'm constantly asked, well, what's the point in having a good framework when it's not being implemented? But you do see the UPR process as a form of implementation. The second is special procedures, mandate holders. These are almost 60 experts. They're mainly academics who are elected by the member states in the Human Rights Council and the G8. Some of them are specific to a country, such as Iran and DPRK or Eritrea. And some are thematic, such as freedom of speech and assembly, or extrajudicial executions, torture, or water and poverty. So many of those, they visit countries and they make recommendations. And finally, you have the 10 treaty bodies. The treaty bodies actually precede the Human Rights Council. They, in turn, are staffed by highly qualified individuals, once again, professionals, academics, retired judges, and so on. You would have heard that the Vatican was reviewed by the Committee Against Torture and the Committee on the Rights of the Child on their failure to investigate and punish priests who had allegedly abused children. So the Vatican, being a signatory to those treaties, did appear before the Council. A wonderful jurisprudence is being produced over the years by these treaty bodies. So if you want to consult all this, you go to the OHCHR website and look up the Universal Human Rights Index. So at a fingertip, if either on a subject matter such as torture or a country situation, or if you want to know what were the recommendations made by other states to your own state, you get it all there, the Universal Human Rights Index. So I was talking about accountability, which I felt fell squarely within the mandate of the High Commissioner. My calls for accountability or referral by the Security Council to the International Criminal Court for investigation of suspected serious crimes met with resistance by some, mainly from the countries concerned, on the basis that, here again, this was exceeding my mandate, that it was a violation of state sovereignty and an interference in the internal affairs of a country, or where matters for political resolution, rather than human rights scrutiny. So constant pushback on these and constant efforts to powerfully assert the need for accountability on the part of governments. So this would be the reaction each time I encourage the Human Rights Council to hold urgent debates or special sessions that resulted in investigation, fact-finding missions, or commissions of inquiry. And these commissions of inquiry include the Israeli military operations in occupied Palestinian territories and Gaza. It includes the commission of inquiry in Syria, which is still ongoing, inquiry in Libya, and the High Commissioner's investigations in Sri Lanka, more recently DPRK and Eritrea. DPRK is another interesting instance of where the situation there was never addressed in the Human Rights Council, except that they did appoint a special mandate holder specific to DPRK. So what happened was, I saw a number of survivors from those camps in DPRK, heard their stories, felt truly moved. One of the women said to me, they really don't know why they and their families had been lifted en bloc and placed in these camps with no access to anyone. And there was lots of forced marriages and violations there, mainly starvation. They had very little food to eat. They were working in coal mines. And when this woman had a baby, she had nothing to put on that baby except leaves, dried leaves. She covered her newborn baby with, and then she found old socks. She stitched that, put it on this baby. And I thought this situation is untenable. And so I made the speech. I went to the Human Rights Council and made the speech to say, you have to look into the situation of DPRK. And that resulted in a commission of inquiry which was chaired by Judge Michael Kirby of Australia. Do look at that report. And Judge Kirby says he's seen many atrocities in this world. This is about the worst. They were not allowed into the DPRK, but they held sessions and heard witnesses outside in South Korea. The outcome is that the council resolved that there'll be a standing office based in South Korea that will continue with these investigations. And the interesting development is that the government of DPRK seems to relent, because the report is really appalling. It was debated and discussed in the General Assembly. And so there they said they will finally let in the special rapporteur into their country. So a little glimmer of hope there. Let me say that in my own experience throughout the dark years of apartheid in my country, I was firmly convinced of the need to be guided by a system of universally recognized values of what is right and just. Because we suffered under apartheid, even when President Mandela appeared in his first court case, not his second one, for treason, his first one. He refused to plead because he said, I don't expect justice in this court. There was just no fair trial procedures. And President Mandela was not president then. Before he went into prison, he was a lawyer. And he said, this is a white man's court and I don't expect justice here. And the magistrate said, yes, well, it is a white man's court and that's the way it's going to be. And if you don't plead, I'm going to sentence you, and so on. And so we grew up knowing the value of having an international system of standards so that we can constantly aspire to fulfilling those standards. So these standards and norms, together with the tools to implement them, is an important achievement of the United Nations. I would say the international community can benefit from an approach that I adopted through independence, impartiality, probity, and truth-telling, that we can influence outcomes, and only then can we have real impact on the state's protection of human rights. By prioritizing human rights, by placing people at the center of their deliberations and decisions, rather than the international community following narrowly defined national and regional interests, following political partisanship, not holding their friends to the same standard as their foes, and tolerating huge atrocities and crimes under the guise of protecting sovereignty. So during my term, I had the opportunity to address the Security Council many times, more times than all the previous high commissioners together. I saw this as a wonderful recognition by the Security Council that as they delivered on their mandate of peace, security, and development, they understood that they needed to know the human rights situation as well, because it is the human rights violations that are alerts to conflicts brewing or war crimes brewing. And so with regard to Syria, when I called for a referral by the Security Council that Syria be referred for investigation by the International Criminal Court, it was shocking to me beyond belief that war crimes and crimes against humanity have become commonplace and occur with complete impunity. So I was disappointed that the Security Council, with 13 votes in favor and 2 against, has been unable to reach agreement on action to ensure accountability for such crimes. I had an opportunity to brief them finally before I left, and I was invited by the Security Council to do so, and I told them that by their failure to agree and act collectively in the face of horrendous violations, they were responsible for the deaths of thousands of people in Syria. A strong statement, but that is what the Security Council is there for. And as I addressed them, I said, it's just like a courtroom, you know, three of us sitting on a bench. You think we liked each other? You think we agreed with each other all of the time? No. But we knew that we had to deliver a decision. I said juries, I think we don't have juries, but I think when juries disagree, they are locked up until they come to a decision. I don't know whether I'm right. I told them that, and they said, oh, so now you want to lock up the Security Council. Let me urge you to pay some attention to the fact that it's 70 years since the United Nations was established, and everybody's looking into a reform, the 70-year reform, and do think of how we can make the United Nations reintroduce the words of its preamble, the people of the United Nations, to see how civil society can have greater democratic space to participate in these halls. Because let me return to my point, it's because of the push from civil society that we have these very many treaties, conventions, and protections for civil society. So thank you so much, David. I think my time's up. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that inspiring speech, which is a call to action which is appropriate at a university like this that's full of so many young people who are the promise for the future. And the original idea was that I would ask the first question, which we talked about, but I have so many here in my hand that I think we should let the questions from the audience come first. So the first question is, how do you maintain your belief in systems like the United Nations when the UN is beholden to vast swaths of special interests? Do you think the United Nations is still relevant as a body despite these interests?
Firstly, let me say I look forward to the dialogue that you have. So questions as well as your contributions. You know, none of us has all the answers to this. That's why I explained to you I was landed with the mandate I was not familiar with and used that mandate to the fullest. Much frustration is being expressed, particularly in the media, on whether human rights are relevant and whether the United Nations is relevant. Now, don't ask a South African whether the United Nations is relevant, because United Nations helped us end apartheid and have a revolution peacefully. Not just the United Nations, meaning the international community, children who refuse to buy South African oranges. So there are many successful stories to the United Nations. Right now, there are almost 4 million Syrians in camps, forced out of their homes because of the conflict there. All they want to do is return to their homes. So who is taking care of these refugees? Who is feeding them and protecting them and providing security? So we have to ask, what would we do without the United Nations, which is the body that jumps in these critical situations, including natural disasters such as the earthquake in Haiti. But do remember that the United Nations is a body of governments. And this is why the politics are so prevalent in that. And why I feel for a reform of the UN, we need to hear more civil society voices, just as civil society did 22 years ago when they insisted that there should be a special independent office taking care of the human rights of everyone in the world.
The next question is, do you think the United Nations has sufficient power to intervene in genocide or ongoing human rights violations? What's the major barrier to intervention?
these decisions are made by the Security Council. So it's only the Security Council that has the power and uses its tools. It could be pressure, persuasion, punitive measures such as sanctions, and in the last resort, military intervention. The United Nations doesn't have an army. It looks to member states to contribute peacekeepers. And if you look at the record, these troops don't come from developed countries. They come from really poor countries who are looking for employment for their soldiers, I imagine. So that's how the United Nations is hamstrung. It doesn't have an army. The Security Council itself told me we don't have any enforcement powers. So if we pass a resolution and it's not implemented, they told me we went physically and visited South Sudan, where, as you know, these two leaders are fighting. People are dying in between. I was there myself. The UN has a huge compound there. So the Security Council said, having seen this and seeing that, yes, children are being recruited forcibly, men and women are being killed, sexual violence is rampant, but we don't have any enforcement powers to get these two leaders to cooperate. So that's where we are, no implementation powers. It's actually only a few states that are not complying with United Nations strictures and resolutions. If you think about it, it's less than 10 states now that are embroiled in conflict, and Syria is actually a shameful example of failure by the United Nations. But otherwise, all the other states are steadily working on their laws and trying to catch up with developed countries, trying to catch up with standards set by the United Nations, the treaty bodies, and so on. So it is a political body, and it cannot just intervene for genocide. It's only the Security Council that can refer investigations into allegations of genocide to the International Criminal Court.
We have a very wide range of questions, and I want to try to do justice to that. Many of them are addressed to particular human rights situations, some to larger issues, but others more broadly. And one I think that is of particular interest to many in our audience, students that are here. What advice do you have for someone trying to break into the international human rights field?
I would say you have to jump in. And if you do get an opportunity, try and visit these sessions in the Human Rights Council. Many people, other agencies in the UN, the Deputy Secretary General, the Secretary General said to me, you have the best staff in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Even the interns have to have their masters or registered for a PhD to be an intern. And they all love it. They take such risks. They work under such difficult conditions in the forests of DRC. I saw them in Jonglei State. Just one of my staff had rounded up all these women under the tree, and none of them understood each other. They came from different tribes. They spoke different languages. So we had 3 sets of interpretation. And my staff had worked with them. 2 of the women complained that their husbands had killed their 12-year-old daughters because the father had arranged a marriage between the 12-year-olds and some 65-year-old cattle breeder, because in Jonglei, wealth is measured in terms of cattle. So you trade the women or your daughter for cattle. Though in those 2 cases, the 12-year-olds refused, so the father and brothers killed them. And the one mother said to me, I know where my daughter is buried. I've told the police I can point it out, but there's been no investigation. Do we have any rights, they asked. So we just continued with the discussion. And some months later, the ambassador came to tell me that something that had never happened before happened. Those women in Jonglei got together, led a delegation to the governor, and said, we want our human rights respected. Small gains, you would agree, but can you imagine working there and achieving that result? That gain that has been established there will never be lost. Just like you are benefiting from all the gains started by the women's movement in the United States that we all took up. So what my generation had to tolerate, you will not have to put up with that at all. For instance, I was married, a lawyer. My husband, who first served as my clerk, then became a lawyer. I was still a minor under law. He was my guardian. So you don't have to face this because battles were fought step by step. That's why it's very important for you. Please jump into what's happening in human rights work. You will be inspired by the people who work there, their skills, their expertise, and how they keep at it. They don't give up. I can give you many more examples. In Guatemala, the office there trained the indigenous women to fight their own battles. So the indigenous women in Guatemala brought cases against multinational companies with regard to exploitation of their lands, and they won those cases. These were women who just a few years ago never spoke up. It was a traditional system. They never spoke up. So as I say, small gains, there are very many issues besides conflicts that we need to address all the time. And you are sitting with skills. You can be so helpful. Just help someone in a developing world to articulate what it is they want. In my view, all the Occupy Street protests that were held were very passionate, but nobody there could tell me exactly what it is they're asking for and what are the solutions they're speaking. So we need the voices of the young to articulate that.
Well, this question sort of follows on what you were saying. What would you say is the most pressing human rights issue the international community should prioritize and take action against? And how can we engage people and key stakeholders in regard to those issues, for example, female genital mutilation or the use of drones, etc.?
Well, clearly, conflicts where people lose their lives are the most serious. We have to address that immediately. We have to provide shelter, security, and food for refugees. We have to address poverty. We have to address the huge inequalities between the rich and poor that is growing. So I hesitate to say this is a priority, and that a Roma person in Germany or a migrant in Europe trying to cross the Mediterranean should just wait they should wait their turn till we get to their human rights. So that's why I say we can't grade human rights, because for you, the violation you're undergoing is serious for you. You want that addressed. But seriously, where there are conflicts, then all rights are endangered. And that's why I would say that that's a situation of urgency. And of course, the question itself points us in the direction of what it matters to young girls to be forcibly circumcised, subject to female genital mutilation. The UN and the Office of the High Commissioner takes up all these issues, both under discrimination, under health issues, under reproductive rights. So we are addressing them. One of the new issues I addressed is albinism. So that's another new item we got onto the agenda, particularly in a country like Tanzania, where the limbs taken of live albinos apparently are very valuable. I was shocked how much people pay for those limbs, which points to where's the market? It's the rich people. So they believe that these limbs will bring them luck, wealth, or whatever. But the person who came to see me came from Canada. To all intents and purposes and appearance, he looked like a white man to me. And he tells me he's an albino, he's discriminated, and that's why he formed this group. And I said, but why'd you call yourself an albino? And he said, you see, his eyelashes were white. Can you imagine being discriminated on that ground? They discriminated at work. They discriminated because obviously they can't be out in the sunlight. They need special care and protection. So it's not only that they are preyed upon and discriminated against, teased and bullied. I heard a terrible case of a rape recently, and it was because she was gang raped and killed, this girl, because she was an albino person. So what am I saying here? Every violation counts, and let's watch out for this. Don't have anyone say to you, female genital mutilation is a cultural practice. Ask that 6-year-old girl. Ask the mothers who had suffered that practice whether they would want to see their daughters be subjected to that. Ask prostitutes if they would encourage their daughters to become prostitutes as well. And so therefore we have to address that question as well, the criminalization of the Johns who make use of these services.
There are two questions that sort of follow on a point you just made and that you also raised in your lecture, which concerns issues of objections that universal standards are imposed by the West and are a product of the West and so forth. So there are two questions that relate to that, and I'll read both of them to you. How does the Human Rights Council account for cultural relativity when imposing human rights laws in other countries? And the second question, at what point does coercing a state to adhere to international standards infringe on a state's ability to institute their own stance on what is and is not morally reprehensible?
There are cultural differences. In my own country, for instance, President Mandela had to compromise to end the serious violence that was going on in Natal province. And the compromise was to give space to the traditional leaders. So we taxpayers, are paying for the Zulu royal king and his umpteen wives. And I just got home and heard it's already before May, he had spent his 54 million rand allowance, and he was asking for money. So many problems as you compromise. But let's look at the context. Sometimes states have to do this, as Mandela had to do. Otherwise, there would have been serious violence. There are traditional societies who believe in their leaders. But as to values and standards, everybody, including the Zulu king, is subject to the Constitution, which says everyone is equal and nobody must be discriminated against. So, comes to the crunch, the Equality Clause trumps any traditional practice. I, as a judge, studied my mandate and found, so who created this Universal Declaration? Everybody, and the conventions, the states. It's true, not all states have signed up to those two conventions or other conventions. You know very well the United States has not ratified CEDAW, the Convention Eliminating Discrimination Against Women. The United States is not a party, together with South Sudan and Somalia, is not a party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Nevertheless, the United States said they are implementing these provisions under their national laws. What does that mean? Unless a state has specifically said, we don't follow that convention, we don't believe in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Not a single state has said that. And therefore I say, you created the law, you created obligations for yourself to implement that standard. I've been to many states where they have told me plainly, for instance, this is a 100% Jewish state, that's why only Jews are nationals. And non-Jews are not nationals in Israel. I've been to Maldives, Indonesia, where they said this is a 100% Muslim country. So if you're not Muslim, you get no rights. The Chief Justice in Indonesia told me he's attended many judicial conferences, and they just do not see eye to eye with Western judges who speak about equality, because they, being a Muslim country, follow the Quran. And the Quran doesn't speak of equality between the genders. And yet I had very good meetings in all the Gulf states. Early on in my mandate, I visited 7 states, one after the other. The first meeting was in Saudi Arabia with the king. And he apparently only gives meetings of 20 minutes. 1.5 hours later, there we were. And he agreed with the values set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He believed in the principle of equality. What he said is that he has to go very slowly in his country. Otherwise, there'll be a reaction from the right wing, the conservatives in that country. So that was his explanation, and I found, as High Commissioner, I had to understand that. And over the years, we now train them to address gender rights. The office went there and spent 5 weeks training, so they set up a national human rights institution. What I say about these cultural rights, that these are Western notions, the individual rights are Western notions, is pain. So whether you're a woman from the developing country or you're a Western woman, if you're being beaten up, the pain is the same. Not a single society will approve of rape, for instance. So as you begin to look at the examples, in my time at least, I heard less and less of that these are Western notions. In fact, the Universal Declaration was drafted not just by Western states, but all states, including Africa, including Egypt. So those are the standards. Was there a second part to that question?
No, I think you addressed both parts, actually. Can you please speak a bit more about the question of Syria and how it should be addressed?
That's such a difficult question.
You mean the other questions were easy? I thought they were all quite difficult, actually.
Well, with regard to Syria, you know that the ambassador called me a lunatic. And one of my staff printed a T-shirt with lunatic on it. So he called me a lunatic because I was reporting on the Commission of Inquiry's report. That is still being conducted. They're not allowed inside Syria, but they are on the borders. And Carla Del Ponte, the former prosecutor of the Yugoslav Tribunal, is part of that team, and she's investigating the crime-based elements of the conflict. So we have a lot of information on what is going on in Syria. And 4 years ago, in my first address to the Security Council on Syria, I said peaceful protesters were on the street asking for their human rights, for their civil and political rights, for their economic and social rights. They were shot at by government forces, and 1,000 have been killed. You have to intervene. So our point is that human rights violations are indicators to more serious outcomes. And this is exactly how Syria has unfolded. Now there's a spillover of the conflict into Iraq. You have the activities of ISIL. Once again, unimaginable atrocities. No control over these rebel forces. No question about where they're getting their arms and ammunition from, because honestly, it's developed countries that manufacture weapons. So where are they getting that from? Where are they getting the money to buy these weapons? Are very serious questions that all of us are asking because of this protracted conflict. So Syria is recognized as a failure. The United Nations only works if everyone cooperates with the standards adopted by all states. It's exactly like you would have chaos outside here in the streets if you didn't obey the traffic laws or the regulations of the road. And we all do so, not because we will be punished if we don't, but because it benefits the whole of society to have rules and regulations. So the United Nations is helpless when there are rogue states who do not comply. So my statement to the Security Council more recently was that there are violations by rebel forces and government forces, but the greater atrocities are being committed by the defense forces of Syria. And that's when the ambassador called me a lunatic. Now, if that was nonsense, they should let us into the country to see for ourselves. Syria has become also extremely costly for the international community, and it takes away much needed aid needed, for instance, in countries like Central African Republic. How can we address this? Let's think in terms of the reform. Nobody has any ideas because the United Nations is a voluntary body. It doesn't have an army. It can't intervene. And most people are against military intervention. Those who voted against sanctions or action against Syria used as an argument the military intervention in Libya, which they say failed, because that state is now dysfunctional with the various brigades, armed brigades in control of various parts of the country. It's a huge problem, but we still need a forum where all of us, all governments can get together and constantly persuade Syria to comply with the United Nations decrees.
This is a very different kind of question, but I think it's one that's important in this setting. How can private philanthropy leverage its independence to fight human rights abuses?
This is working. If you look at the Bill Gates Foundation and Warren Buffett and what some of your donors here are doing independently, Jimmy Carter with his Handa Center. He, for instance, really believes in doing the small things, building lavatories which cost $2 each. Makes a real difference in the lives of people, he says. And he dealt with river worms and all kinds of issues like that, river blindness caused by worms. So he's, for instance, is a good example of people operating outside the United Nations or in cooperation with the United Nations to make a difference concretely on the ground. We have to welcome how HIV/AIDS has been addressed and reduced in very many countries. So this is the UN's UN/AIDS office working closely with private philanthropists. We need their donation and their money. Some of them have more wealth than the national budget of states, so they are in a position to help.
What was your involvement in the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and do you think that a similar institution could be useful in particular country situations today?
Well, I was not directly involved in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but I was a lawyer, and we prepared many of our clients to go and tell their stories there. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission was not just tears and forgiveness. There was attached to it an amnesty court, a judicial court. That court decided who gets to be prosecuted and who does not. And a huge disappointment to most people is that the alleged perpetrators were not even required to say sorry, just that they should explain their role. Many of them were relieved of prosecution. And many lawyers in South Africa, even now, are unhappy about the lack of reparation for victims, the immunity from prosecution that serious violators have managed to get out of the TRC process. So some happiness, but mainly it was accepted by the population of South Africa. And that's important. If the population buys this, which I describe as a politically expedient way in which South Africa dealt and put behind its past so that they could concentrate on building a nation. I understand the South African model was built on the model in Peru, so we learn and advance these alternative justice mechanisms. I think that they are necessary. It's for the people to decide what kind of justice they want. It's interesting that in Latin America, they're still prosecuting dictators and those in the military who had committed serious human rights violations and crimes, because that is what the people want. They want justice. So as a judge, I myself would prioritize justice, but I respect where people themselves decide on alternative measures, such as the Gacaca system in Rwanda. It's a small country. They had 150,000 accused persons in their custody, in prison. They weren't even prisons. There was no food for these prisoners. They could come and go, but they all went back into the prison shelters because they were afraid of vigilante justice outside there. So I sat on the Rwanda tribunal, and people in Rwanda were very aggrieved that all we had done over a length of time was 8 cases. And we'd spent $8 million doing that. And they had no money, no resources, and they had all these individuals to take care of. So they reverted to what they said was a traditional system. Other people told me no such thing, there was no such tradition. So probably it was a politically expedient way themselves to have the Gacaca courts, which is the courts on the grass. The judges were elected by the community. Their sentences were not always punitive. They sometimes ordered a perpetrator to help build the house of the victim, for instance. So that's what the community wanted. Many of us looked at the fair trial procedures. I looked at the fact that all the judges were Tutsi, for instance. There were no Hutu judges. So one can criticize this, but that's how they handled it, put their past behind. And of course, you know, Rwanda is now doing very well economically, not so well on human rights protection, not so well on respecting freedom of expression, but economically, they're doing well.
Okay, we just have, I think, time for...
That's a lot of questions.
Yes, and well, you've been extremely expeditious in going through so many. There are so many good questions here, and I have to thank the audience for that. But there's one that I think would be a nice way to round off your wonderful presentation. If you could go back and change one thing during your tenure as High Commissioner for Human Rights, what would it be?
You know, we always agonize that you could have done something better. You could have fought harder. I shouldn't have given in so much. I did try very much to see, for instance, the president of Cameroon, who was there for 30 years, and felt very badly that he didn't turn up. It was on the agenda and he didn't turn up. Why? Because I was talking to one of the women ministers on the forced and early marriage of girls, which is a violation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Cameroon is a party to that convention. And I said that I understand there was penal reform passed by Parliament 10 years ago, which would have covered the situation of forced and early marriages. And is that true? And she said, no, that's not true. The law was passed by Parliament 19 years ago. The president has not signed the law, the act into law as yet. So I would have liked to have confronted him on that. So many opportunities where we could have done much more. We all do the best we can. Now, in hindsight, after 6 years' experience, yes, I think that I would. I would be much stronger in covering human rights, and particularly economic rights. The world woke up to the importance of economic rights after Tunisia, the Tunisian revolution. Because there, shortly before that revolution, development agencies, and you know who I mean, these big bodies, including the UN's development agency, all produced reports that things were going very well under President Ben Ali in Tunisia. Everybody was happy, economic growth was there. And yet a graduate student set himself alight because he could not find a job, which started the revolution there and spread to other countries such as Egypt. And so that was a failure. Who was the UN speaking to when they produced those reports? So fortunately, Tunisia asked for the Human Rights Office to be opened there immediately, and the office is still there, working very carefully. For instance, I was telling you, David, that they altered the word equality in their constitution and put in complementarity between men and women. So it took a lot of pressure from the office to get them to change it back to equality. So work like that, and I would think that Tunisia is a success story, but it taught all of us to pay attention to economic rights. The Wall Street and other occupied cities protests alerted us to the rage and anger and frustration of people, that their lives are being affected by decisions taken by institutions that are opaque. We don't know how they decide these or make these financial decisions, and why banks did what they did without accountability, but impacted our lives, impoverished many people. So that would be an area that I would cover. So I learned halfway through my term the importance of that.
So thank you very much. This is the conclusion to your visit of these past 2 days at Stanford, and it's been wonderful to have you here, and this has been a great opportunity for our students, and let's thank Ms. Pillay for the wonderful presentation she's made today.
Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.